Alright, so Canada's developed a brand new jet interceptor, and we feel that America might be interested in purchasing this aircraft for the USAF. Alright, tell me about it. It's called the Avro Arrow. It's super fast. It can fly at speeds around twice the speed of sound. Okay, well, tell me more. Well, it features a new wing design called the Delta Wing, allowing it to go super fast and fit more fuel for a longer range, as well as better maneuverability. Okay. It can also operate in all sorts of weather conditions, and at heights of up to 70,000 feet. Okay. And it features a revolutionary new type of control system where it's flown electronically. Okay, and to top it all off, it runs on maple syrup. We'll take your entire Wait, did you say it runs on maple syrup? Yeah. One sec.
Yeah, Dave, I think we'll just build our own plane. These Canadians are clearly nuts.
Though we may get a bit bent from time to time, we shall never be beaten.
The Second World War saw the emergence of many advances in technology. Perhaps most notably was the jet aircraft. Following the end of the war, the nations of the world scrambled to build jets, knowing that their stake in the future of the aerospace industry would depend on how quickly they could get their foot in the door. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union emerged as the three leaders in the jet industry, building both jet fighters and jet passenger aircraft. However, another country began developing jets at a rapid pace, keeping up with the other three nations and itself contending to be a titan of the aerospace industry: Canada. During World War II, Canada's aircraft industry mostly consisted of license-building British and American-designed aircraft, with Hurricanes, Lancasters, Catalinas, and many more aircraft being built in Canada for use by the Royal Canadian Air Force during the war.
Away and over the sea they roar, loaded with bombs, each bomb big enough to blast an area of 10 city blocks. Coming in over the...
After the war, however, the Canadian government and Canadian aircraft companies realized that jet aircraft would not only dominate the skies of the future, but that the development of homegrown Canadian jet aircraft would be beneficial to Canada and her aerospace industry. This, combined with the rise of the Cold War, saw a large expansion of the budget for the Royal Canadian Air Force, despite its recent reduction in strength. And immediately following the end of the Second World War, the RCAF began to look for a new jet fighter, creating a specification for this aircraft in 1946. This new jet fighter would be able to patrol and intercept aircraft along Canada's expansive borders. Canada wanted this new jet to be able to operate in all of Canada's varied weather conditions, especially the harsh cold, as well as having an advanced radar system for night operations. The RCAF also wanted this aircraft to have two engines, ideal for cold weather operations, as well as a crew of two. The RCAF had already begun to evaluate the British de Havilland Vampire for purchase, and eventually in 1948 the Vampire would enter service as Canada's first ever jet fighter. However, the Vampire did not meet the requirements that the RCAF put out for a new jet interceptor, and it soon became apparent that no such fighter existed anywhere in the world. It was decided that this aircraft would have to be newly developed, and as the Canadian government wanted to grow the Canadian aerospace industry, it was decided that this new aircraft would be developed in Canada. In late 1945, the RCAF put out a requirement for Canadian companies to submit a design for this new jet fighter. One company to submit a design was Avro Canada, a rapidly expanding Canadian aircraft manufacturer which was originally known as Victory Aircraft, before being sold to the Hawker Siddeley Company to serve as the company's Canadian subsidiary. During the Second World War, Victory had been Canada's largest aircraft company, churning out over 400 Avro Lancaster bombers and over 3,000 Avro Anson trainers under license from Avro in the UK. Avro Canada mainly focused on maintenance for piston engine aircraft in Canada's military, however, as Canada's foremost aerospace company, also heavily researched designs on jet engines and jet aircraft. Avro Canada's initial designs were enough for the RCAF to award them a contract to develop these designs into a prototype, deemed the XC-100. Although many of the designers and engineers who worked on the project for Avro were Canadian, some were British and American who had come to Avro Canada from their respective countries, and this led to the company gaining a reputation as one of the top aerospace companies not only in Canada, but also in the Western world. The efforts on the XC-100 took over 4 years, with the RCAF ordering 10 aircraft for evaluation purposes in 1949. Avro planned to fit this all-Canadian aircraft with Canadian engines to match Avro Canada's own Orenda engine, which had also been in development for years. In 1950, the first XC-100, now called the Avro CF-100, rolled out of Avro Canada's factory. The first 2 prototypes were fitted with British engines, as the Orenda engine was not yet ready for use in the CF-100. The prototype first flew in 1950, however the program suffered a serious setback when the second prototype crashed, killing the test pilot and calling into question the entire CF-100 program. The delays and issues in developing both the CF-100 and its Orenda engines led to financial losses for Avro Canada, and delays due to issues with the CF-100's structural integrity led to the Canadian government ordering Avro to stop any work on all other projects to complete work on the CF-100. However, once the Orenda engines were completed, there was a noticeable improvement in the aircraft, with test pilots saying that the Canadian engine ran much better than any of its foreign counterparts. The RCAF was satisfied with the aircraft, and in 1953 began taking deliveries of the Avro Canada CF-100 Canuck, the first ever jet to be designed, developed, and built entirely in Canada. The name Canuck never stuck to the aircraft, which was instead called the Clunk by those who flew it. Despite the delays in the program, 6 different marks of the aircraft were produced for both the RCAF and the Belgian Air Force. The Clunk served as both an interceptor and fighter aircraft. However, most RCAF pilots preferred the F-86 Sabre due to the poor maneuverability of the Clunk. Nevertheless, the CF-100 gained a reputation as being able to operate in the harshest conditions that Canada had to offer, even being considered at one point by the United States Air Force for use as a reconnaissance plane. The Canuck would serve until 1981 when the RCAF retired the type, after almost 30 years of service. Despite its shortcomings as a fighter, the CF-100 put Canada on the map in the jet age, and Avro Canada was keen to put themselves atop the jet industry. The company had already shown great promise with not just the CF-100, but also in another project, the C-102 jetliner, a passenger jet aircraft. Although not well known, the jetliner was only the second passenger jet in the world to take to the skies, being narrowly beaten for first by the famous de Havilland Comet. Originally developed for the Canadian flag carrier Trans-Canada Airlines, otherwise known as TCA, in 1946, the jetliner was plagued from the beginning by the contract given to Avro Canada by TCA, which basically held Avro to a fixed development cost and was specifically designed to ensure that Avro paid for the entire development, even if TCA opted to buy the aircraft. However, the flailing project was saved by the Canadian government in 1947, and the C-102 made its first flight in 1949. However, it was at this point that the Canadian government ordered Avro to halt all work on the jetliner and any other projects they were working on to focus on the CF-100, which was also in the latter stages of development at the time. The project was almost saved by the owner of TWA, Howard Hughes, who had multiple times tried to order the jetliner but was refused due to Avro's manufacturing capabilities. Hughes offered to license build the aircraft in the US. However, the Canadian government tightened Avro Canada's leash, and the US would also not allow any new civil aircraft to be developed due to the Korean War and the necessity for military aircraft. The C-102 project was cancelled and the sole prototype donated for testing purposes and later preservation in a museum. However, in a moment of tragedy for Canadian aviation history, the aircraft was scrapped due to a lack of storage space at the Canadian National Research Council. Only the cockpit section of the aircraft survives today at the Canada Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. Avro Canada also had plans for an improved version of the CF-100 called the CF-103. However, newer variants of the Canuck rendered the CF-103 useless. However, Avro Canada had one aircraft up its sleeve that was sure to be one of the best aircraft not only in Canada, but also in the entire world. What they would design would write Avro Canada into Canadian aviation legend, and give Canada the edge in the jet race it needed to be on top, and it would expand Canada's aerospace industry exponentially. This ace up Avro's sleeve was called the Avro Arrow. Although the Canuck met the requirements initially put out by the RCAF, it soon became obvious to Canada that due to an advancement in technology by the Russians, in particular the development of fast Russian jet bombers, that the Canuck would not be able to fill the role of interceptor in the high-speed future. Canada wanted to go supersonic, and it was Avro's job to get Canada up to speed. The CF-100, although able to go supersonic in a dive, was only capable of subsonic speeds in level flight. The RCAF asked Avro Canada to begin research into a supersonic interceptor, still capable of operating in Canada's varying climate. However, making a supersonic aircraft was not as easy as just using a faster engine. It had only been 5 years since Chuck Yeager had broken the sound barrier, that is, achieved supersonic flight, and that was in a small rocket-powered aircraft. The problem that faced basically every aircraft company trying to create a supersonic jet was drag. In order to create a jet capable of supersonic flight, Avro would first need to reduce the drag of the aircraft. The main key to reducing drag was the design of the wing. German research from the war had proved that a thinner wing would provide less drag, but for fuel and storage purposes, jet fighters could not have wings which were too thin. However, one solution was found to this problem. If the aircraft had a wing shape which was swept back, it would reduce drag even if the wing was thicker. Avro Canada opted to use a rather new version of the swept wing design, known as the Delta Wing. The Delta Wing had the same basic advantages of a swept wing design, but the extra wing surface area meant that the aircraft had more room for fuel storage, was capable of slower speeds, and could generate more lift. There were disadvantages to the Delta Wing as well, particularly in its capabilities at low altitudes, but these were brushed aside since it wouldn't be relevant for the aircraft's role as a high-altitude interceptor. In 1953, as the first CF-100s began to enter service, the RCAF gave Avro Canada a requirement for a supersonic interceptor. The aircraft, which would serve as the Canuck's eventual successor, would need to be capable of cruising at altitudes of up to 70,000 feet and at speeds of up to 1.5 times the speed of sound. The RCAF had already attempted to find a foreign aircraft to fill the requirement, but as was the case with the CF-100, none could be found, and Avro was given the task of building Canada's second homegrown fighter jet. It took Avro Canada only a month to submit the design, which was named the C-105. More or less meeting the requirements that the RCAF had put out, the delta-winged aircraft was to be operated by a crew of 2, capable of speeds of almost 2 times the speed of sound, with the weapons bay located on the underside of the aircraft as opposed to wing-mounted missiles, and powered by 4 engines. The design was accepted, and the project was named the CF-105 Aero. Avro decided instead of building a prototype that they would enter straight into pre-production, leading to faster deliveries of the aircraft. It was a gamble, as any major design flaws discovered would lead to the project having to be restarted. Unlike the Canuck, Avro opted to use a foreign engine instead of developing a Canadian engine for the aircraft. The chosen engine was the Rolls-Royce RB-106, which was made in Britain. However, unfortunately for Avro, the RB-106 was cancelled, as was the American engine Avro had planned to use as a backup. This led to Avro being forced to make their own engine for the Aero. They would use a revised version of the Orenda, called the Orenda Iroquois. This new engine would need to be developed, so in the meantime, the Aero would use the Pratt & Whitney J75. After multiple design revisions in the testing phase, some at the direct order of the RCAF, the green light for production was given, and on October 4, 1957, the first Avro Canada CF-105 Aero, RL-201, was rolled out. The CF-105 first flew a few months later in 1958. It was, by all accounts, an amazing aircraft. It flew at speeds of 1.9 times the speed of sound, and it was rumored that it wasn't even at full performance. This is not to say, however, that the Aero was perfect. It had problems with both its landing gear and control system, in particular the autopilot, a concept which was brand new at the time. The problems were worked out relatively quickly, and it was reported that within 6 flights the aircraft was running smoothly. It soon became obvious that the Avro Aero wasn't just a good jet, it was one of the, if not the best jet in the world at the time, for several key reasons. First, the technology utilized in the aircraft was cutting edge, featuring an early version of autopilot and a new technique of controlling the aircraft called fly-by-wire, which converted joystick movements to electronic inputs to move the control surfaces, eliminating the need for control cables and other heavy control systems. The Arrow also featured a lightweight airframe, a navigational computer, and most importantly, incredible performance. Avro had put Canada with one aircraft near the forefront of the world aviation industry, even cracking the 100 largest companies in the world. The Avro Arrow became a symbol of national pride within the nation of Canada, which, despite its large landmass, was inhabited by a mere 17 million people at the time. Yet, with the Arrow, the small nation was beginning to be recognized by the world as one of the leaders in the aerospace industry. However, Canada's dreams of becoming an aviation giant were beginning to be questioned. Both the Canadian Army and the Royal Canadian Navy were unhappy with the Arrow project, arguing that the Air Force was getting an unproportionally large amount of the defense budget to fund the project. Avro had also been unsuccessful at finding any foreign buyers for the Arrow. Both the United States and Britain had been impressed by the Arrow, but instead of purchasing the aircraft, they used it as inspiration to develop their own designs to bolster their own national industries. But the biggest threat to the Arrow would come from the very people who had authorized its creation, the Canadian government. In 1957, on the very same day that the Avro first rolled off the line, the Russian Sputnik satellite was launched, and Canada became starkly aware of its lack of anti-missile defense systems for the country. There was also a rumor that the Soviets had a missile gap on the US and her allies, and Canada became worried that it would be rendered defenseless against any coming intercontinental ballistic missiles. Canada wanted to buy the American Bomark missile, which would be used to shoot down any Soviet missiles. The military now realized that the greatest nuclear threat from Russia was not a bomb from an aircraft, but a missile with a warhead. In 1957, the Canadian Liberal government, who had approved the Arrow project, was voted out, and the Conservatives, who claimed the Liberals had been on a frivolous spending spree, began to question the Arrow project entirely. The new Prime Minister, John Diefenbaker, believed that the future would be solely missiles, and that manned interceptors would become obsolete. On the 20th of February, 1959, which became known as Black Friday, the Prime Minister announced the cancellation of the Avro Arrow program, instead opting to purchase fighter jets from the United States, along with Bomark missiles. The 5 completed Arrows, as well as all production equipment and plans, were ordered to be destroyed. The new Iroquois engines were also cancelled, with all produced engines ordered to be scrapped. Avro tried desperately to save the Arrow, trying to offer it to the National Research Council as an experimental and research aircraft, but it was refused due to a lack of spare parts to maintain the aircraft. The United States and Britain also attempted to acquire the jet for the same purposes, and Avro began preparations to transfer the Arrow. However, they were unable to secure sufficient permissions. The cancellation of the Arrow was the knockout blow for Avro Canada. 30,000 workers, half of whom worked for Avro Canada and the other half for their suppliers, were put out of work by the cancellation of the Arrow. The final blow for Avro Canada was the loss of the brains of the operation. Jim Chamberlain, who had been the chief of technical design on the Arrow project and had been instrumental in the initial success of the jet, left Avro for NASA after the cancellation, taking with him 32 of Avro's best engineers. This team from Avro Canada worked on both the Gemini and Apollo space programs, with the idea of launching an orbiter for the Apollo mission being thought of by Chamberlain. Other Avro engineers left for Britain and would later work on other projects, with the VP of Engineering Jim Floyd eventually working on the Concorde, which was, coincidentally, the second operational aircraft to have used a fly-by-wire system, the first having been the Arrow. Avro Canada, having been drained to the core, never built another aircraft and was dissolved in 1962, 3 years after the cancellation. Having been the ones to put Canada at the front of the aviation game, the demise of Avro Canada was the end of Canada's dream of being an aerospace industry leader. To this day, the CF-100 Canuck is the only jet fighter to ever be fully designed and made in Canada. The decision to scrap the Arrow and buy Bomark missiles instead would haunt Prime Minister Diefenbaker and would eventually lead to the government's collapse and his resignation. However, Canada's aviation industry was not completely dead. De Havilland Canada, another Canadian aircraft company, would design and build a series of short takeoff and landing bush aircraft, as well as two turboprop airliners, the Dash 7 and Dash 8, the latter of which is still in production and is used as a regional commuter aircraft by airlines worldwide. Canada would also redeem itself from the C-102 jetliner cancellation by building a series of commercial jets, this time from the company Bombardier. Bombardier designed and built the Canadian Regional Jet, or CRJ, family of aircraft, which are still in service today. Bombardier also designed the Airbus A220, a regional jet which was acquired by Airbus and introduced in 2013. However, despite these successes in Canadian aviation, Canada is not the aviation giant it was at the height of the Aero program. Although Avro Canada's future, if the Aero had been allowed to continue, is the subject of debate, it is most likely that the Aero and its subsequent successors would have put Canada near the front of the jet race, at a point in history where such technology as was seen in the Aero was unmatched by any other nation. There was, for a while, a rumor that RL-202, the second Aero to be produced, which was absent from the final photos of the Aeros slated to be destroyed, had been ferried away for safekeeping in the United Kingdom, a theory further fueled when an Aero ejection seat was discovered on eBay in the UK. However, after photos of RL-202 being scrapped surfaced, this theory was unfortunately debunked. However, the Aero isn't quite gone. The nose of RL-206 was smuggled out of the factory by Avro employees before it could be destroyed, as were sections of the wings and tail of RL-203, all of which are now on display at the Canadian Aviation and Space Museum in Ottawa. 3 examples of the Aero's Iroquois engines also still survive today in collections and museums across Canada. Various other internal pieces from the Aero also survive around the world. In 2020, the blueprints of the Aero, long believed to have been destroyed, were found after one of the drafters of the plans refused to destroy them and instead took them home. Today, the remaining pieces of the Aero, as well as the memory of the aircraft and the company that put Canada on the top of the aviation world for a short while, live on in Canada, a reminder of what could have been.